I protected my little brother throughout his childhood. I thought this would change when we became adults, but it didn't. In fact, the most important protection I ever provided for my brother came after his wedding. My name is Will Grimes. I am 30 years old at the most critical moment in this story. My brother Jimmy is 2 years younger. I have always been big and strong for my age and had a courageous mindset. I don't seem to have most of the genes that keep people from doing risky things. Because I was big and fearless, after beating up kids in my first 4 fights at school, 3 of my opponents were significantly older than me, I was never seriously challenged again. The only guy tougher than me in the whole area, Brett Hogan, was one of my best friends, and we never did anything more serious than friendly wrestling. Jimmy is the opposite of me in many ways. He is of average height and has the sweetest, kindest disposition of anyone I have ever met in my life. Although he and I have common facial features and skin color, my character is killer, his is compassionate. I'm a fighter, and he avoids confrontation at all costs. Jimmy was kind and gentle all his life. When he was 6 years old, he cried for a week after he saw a crow steal a baby robin from its nest. When he was in 6th grade, he started a program to collect school supplies for poor children in the area, a program that still exists today. When he was a freshman in high school, he started a school campaign to collect charity bags for military personnel serving overseas. During the summers, during high school and college, he worked with charities, restoring and building homes for people affected by floods. When someone in the family was feeling down, Jimmy would console them, tell them jokes, give them homemade gifts, or otherwise lift their spirits. The world is a much better place thanks to Jimmy. Despite his charming personality, the only reason Jimmy made it through school without being bullied was because everyone knew that if anyone teased him, I would show them what I could do. The only time I really had to do this was when he was a freshman in high school and 2 sophomore bullies bullied him. This was not one of the 4 fights I mentioned earlier because it really wasn't a fight, but a massacre that ended with me being suspended for a week and the 2 bullies being hospitalized for 2 nights. Although I loved Jimmy more than anything in the world, the rest of my family was so-so. My father was essentially an indifferent brute. At least he provided well with material things. My mother was a busty, fiery, passionate vamp. Although she did most of the things a mother should do, it was always clear that she put herself first, her children second, and her father third. She was also beautiful. What she saw in my relatively homely father, I never understood. Although my parents had their fair share of arguments, there was usually no tension in our home sphere, because my mother's temperament usually made my father give in quickly enough. However, this was not the case on one of the most unforgettable days of my life. I was a senior in high school and serving the last day of my 1-week suspension for beating up the 2 bullies I mentioned earlier. I was lifting weights in the basement when my parents both came home for dinner, a very unusual event as far as I knew. They probably forgot that I was home on suspension, since they were both at work during the first 4 days of my confinement. As soon as they were both home, a heated argument began. My father found out. How exactly, I was never sure, since this part of the argument was both technical and confusing, that Jimmy was not his biological son. Although I was shocked, it explained a lot about the differences between him and me. My father brought every imaginable accusation against my mother. She was crying hysterically, and for the first time in my memory, she did not answer him in kind. I just listened at the door from the basement to the kitchen, deciding not to make my presence known until my dad started screaming about how he was going to tell Jimmy he was a bastard in addition to all their friends and family. When I opened the door and entered the kitchen, my parents turned pale. "Hi, Dad," I said as calmly as possible. "I really don't think you should do this. You know how sensitive Jimmy is. You both have to swear to me that you will never, ever tell him or anyone else where this might be getting to him." "You have no right to interfere," my father shouted at me. "Mind your own business." "Dad, I insist. Don't tell him and don't let him find out." "I'm serious," I answered, having difficulty remaining calm. "What are you going to do, idiot?" My father grinned mockingly. In an instant, before I could think, I was on it. I put one hand under his chin, and with the other, I pressed his shoulder against the wall. Although he was my size, I had twice his strength and attitude. I had never been physically aggressive towards any member of my family before, but they all knew how strong I was from visits to the principal after my fights. "Let me make this clear, Dad. If you tell Jimmy or let him know, I'll show you where the crayfish spend the winter, plain and simple," I told him as decisively as I could. "Is it clear?" He nodded. I let him go, and when he left the house, he shouted to my mother, "It's not over yet, bitch." I turned to my mother and said, "Mom, make sure Jimmy never finds out." Through tears, she said, "I promise." We haven't seen my father for a week. My mom told Jimmy he had to go on an unexpected business trip. When my father returned, Jimmy hugged him as usual and said, "Dad, I've missed you so much. I hope you don't have to be away for long." This, coupled with my mother and I trying to be as pleasant as possible to my father, seemed to diffuse the situation. A week later, my parents went on a trip together, the first time I could remember the two of them doing it together. And when they returned from the trip, our house was more optimistic than I could ever remember. I noticed that my mom was no longer her #1 priority, but my dad. I had the impression, confirmed by sounds coming from the master bedroom, that I had rarely heard before, that my mother had his brains and the way he wanted them. Speaking of sex, I went through high school and college. Definitely my most memorable co-star was Abigail Britton. Everyone called her Gail, but never Abby. She was in Jimmy's class. Although she was old for her class and was possibly the biggest flirt in the school, she had a slightly above-average face and an amazing body. On a scale of 1 to 10, her face and hair were probably a 6, maybe a 7. Her body was 9.9999999. Her personality was close to 0. She was tasteless and sarcastic and acted like her shit didn't stink. When I was 19 and Abigail was an 18-year-old sophomore, I had the pleasure of pinning her twice at the end of the school year and once during the summer. She pestered me, in her unbearably hostile way, during a geography lesson we had together, including exposing herself to me twice. We both also had a late-term gym, which was compulsory at our high school at the time, although boys and girls were separated. When gym class ended on Friday and everyone else was clamoring to leave school as quickly as possible, I walked behind the partition between the girls' and boys' sections of the gym, grabbed her hand, and pulled into the partition. "Gail, it's time to put up or shut up," I muttered as I pulled her towards me, planting a fat kiss on her and mauling her large breasts. "If you can pick up little Willie," she giggled after I broke our kiss. "Will you give me a ride home then, Grimes?" "Of course," I grinned, "but you won't be able to walk normally for 2 days. I hope you don't have any hot dates this weekend." "You're a vain bastard, aren't you?" She sneered. I didn't want to talk to her. I just wanted to have her, so I led her up the back stairs of the gym to the wrestling training area. This place was deserted, since the wrestling season had long passed, and wrestling was not part of the physical education curriculum. By the time I grabbed 2 rugs from the top of the pile, threw them on the tile floor, and turned around, Gail had already taken off her tracksuit and bra and was reaching for her panties. I was so excited that, despite her head start, by the time she threw her panties aside, I was already naked. The woman's naked body looked even better than I thought. I started to get excited so much that it hurt. I immediately laid her on the double mat and started giving her pleasure. She was apparently not used to this. Most guys were probably just having her as quickly as possible, but it really turned me on to inspect and caress her body before having sex with her. After caressing, we had sex. I lay next to Abigail for about 10 minutes, kissing one breast and massaging the other. God, how good it was for them. Unfortunately, then she started talking and this big piece of ass turned into a nasty asshole, so I broke it off. I had to help her get dressed, and after we showered in separate changing rooms, I drove her to the trailer park house as she had asked. On the way there, she apparently tried her own version of the word sweet, which most people would find slightly tart. On the way to her trailer park, Abigail said over and over again that it was the best sex she's ever had. But I didn't know whether to believe her. I started to think this might be true when she escalated her flirting to the limit the following week at school. 2 weeks after we had sex for the first time, she told me that her sister's trailer would be available on Saturday night. I actually ran out to dinner before taking her there and having sex 3 times that night. However, talking to her about pillows bothered me. Her personality did not begin to grow in me, and I never saw her again during the school year. The only time I seriously interacted with her was 2 days before I left for college when I really needed to just have sex. While I certainly didn't want a relationship with Abigail, I have to admit that the 3 times I slept with her were probably the most physically satisfying of my life, even if I was emotionally bankrupt. Because I didn't want a relationship with her, I never returned the phone calls and emails she sent me during the summer and my first 2 years of college. Her attempts to communicate with me finally stopped when I entered my freshman year. In college, I studied criminal justice, computer science, forensic science, and of course, female anatomy. I did pretty well in all of them, best in female anatomy, although I've never been in a relationship that lasted more than 3 months. To afford school, I worked as a bouncer 2 nights a week and during the summer. I learned a lot by doing this. First of all, even though I was cooler than 98% of the guys, there were some guys you don't mess with alone. One particular slap to the ass taught me that in spades. Secondly, teamwork was necessary to resolve the worst situations. Third, conversation and sincerity were often as important as firmness in difficult situations. In college, I learned that office work was not for me, that I was smarter and more resourceful than smart, and that the career that was probably best suited for me was bounty hunting. I teamed up with Brett Hogan, my tough buddy from high school, who at the time was a 6'4", 290-pound piece of granite with biceps the size of tree branches, thighs as thick as tree trunks, and no guts. He was working some dead-end job, and while he wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed, he had everything, including 3 years of Marine Corps experience, that I needed to do my job safely. I provided the brains and brawn, and he provided the muscle and intimidation. Brett and I did well, but I did all the skip tracking and computer work myself, which was inefficient at best. A year and a half later, we added Austin, a computer geek I knew from college, as an ID tracker and computer expert, and 6 months later, we joined forces with Becca, a seasoned, cerebral female private investigator. By the time I graduated from college 4 years ago, the synergy our group created had made us very successful, and I was making more money than I thought I would ever be able to. We were all comfortable splitting a share of 30% for me, 25% for Austin and Becky, and 20% for Brett, since it really matched our individual contributions, and working together gave us double the share of the pie that the 4 of us working individually could get. We all made sure to establish good relationships with the local police officers, giving them leads and never stopping what they were doing. It didn't hurt that Becca was the assistant chief of police's favorite niece. At the time, my mom and dad were surprisingly still getting along great, and Jimmy had graduated from college and was making a good living as a CT scan technologist at the largest local hospital, and he also fell in love. This is where my story really begins. Who did Jimmy fall in love with? Abigail Britton. I could not believe it. The sweetest, most compassionate, and kind-hearted person I knew fell in love with a disgusting slut. When I first saw them together, I was almost speechless for a full minute. My brain was unable to process the information. Abigail has changed somewhat for the better since middle school. She actually got a decent job as a beautician and spruced up her appearance, so she didn't look like trailer trash and be so moody. What didn't change was her 9.99999 body, although with her modern hair and makeup, her face was now a clear 7. However, I found it hard to believe that she had learned to keep her hips together with any guy who caught her fancy, or that it would be easy for her to live. When Jimmy confessed to me how serious he was about Abigail, I tried to point out her past struggles as gently as possible. I also talked to him and told him that she and I had sex several times. Jimmy's response: "I know she had a reputation in the past, and she told me that you and her had sexual relations several times, However, she is a different woman, and I know and she swears that she will be faithful. Me when we get married. Also, when you get to know her, she's really, really nice. Poor, ignorant Jimmy, I thought. I wanted to believe that she had really changed. But I wasn't that gullible or naive. My suspicions were confirmed when I heard about the bachelorette party that sweet Abigail and her tattered bitch of honor Jersey were planning. When I was in school, Jersey was the biggest available girl in high school, even orders of magnitude larger than Abigail, and was clearly a bad influence. It really helped to be on a team with an insightful woman, Becca. Becca was aware of almost everything that was happening in our city. Also, Brett was dating one of Abigail's less slutty friends, and while Brett wasn't smart, he was discreet and never told his girlfriend about my relationship with Jimmy. Brett only kept me informed about everything, but didn't give me any information. I got all the information I needed from Becky and Brett. Abigail and Jersey planned to send Abigail into her chaste married life by arranging for her to have sex with multiple partners 3 days before the wedding. The participants were 4 poor souls from their school days. While these 4 guys weren't the lowest scum of the pond, they were just a notch above. Brett and I gathered 4 guys and talked to them. Since Brett and I were armed, even if they could handle us, we were safe. However, they could not cope with us. After that, and the fact that I had given them $50 for an easy-to-get girl, there was no doubt that the 4 scoundrels would do as we said. Just don't come. Don't tell anyone about this ahead of time, and if they ask you later, just say that you have a better offer, I advised them. Austin installed a GPS in the limousine Jersey rented to hit the bars for a bachelorette party after they stood up for sex with several guys. Brett, Becca, and I, wearing pretty decent masks, kept an eye on them all night. Our job was made a little easier when we paid a decent-looking biker chick $200 to pounce on Jersey and take her out of sight. Abigail got really mad and started groping her, but the 3 of us were able to ensure she didn't get fucked, probably much to her disappointment. Jimmy and Abigail's wedding and post-bachelorette reception were disappointing. The only disgusting feature was when Abigail grabbed me from the waist down and licked me while we were dancing at the reception. The rest of Abigail's family were on their best behavior because they knew she was marrying for financial and social status. After they had been married for about 2 years, I almost began to believe that maybe Abigail could remain faithful to Jimmy. Abigail curbed her flirtations and wandering glances whenever I was at events they were also present at, and they always seemed to be loving each other. Whenever Jimmy and I talked, he seemed happy, and he was never good at hiding his feelings if he was unhappy. About 2 years after the wedding, I received the first message that Abigail was cheating on Jimmy. Becca got the initial information, Austin did the necessary research, and one quiet day, I went looking for evidence. I'm lucky. That same day, during my lunch break, I watched Abigail get into her car around the corner from the beauty salon where she worked, kiss the guy behind the wheel, and head to a nearby cheap motel. I took good photos of the guy and, using my charm and a court officer badge, which looked like a police badge, although I never said I was a police officer, I got his name from the motel registration. The name was genuine, as he paid with a credit card. The guy's name was Sam Hastings. He was 30, single, clean, good-looking, and a skilled carpenter. I was grateful that at least he wasn't a scumbag. In addition to being a computer geek, Austin was also a theater buff and well-versed in makeup thanks to college and involvement in community theater. Undercover, the following Friday night, I followed Sam to what was probably his favorite bar. I became friends with him, playing pool, discussing sports and his brand of beer. When he decided to call it a night, I went with him to his car and subdued him with a stun gun. I put Sam in the back seat of his car, sedated him, and drove him to Austin's house. Austin spent about an hour making it look like he'd been beaten 10 times. When Austin finished, I would never have believed it was fake if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. Austin and I then took a photo of Sam. Austin followed me as I drove Sam's car to a secluded area and parked it inches from the edge of the cliff. While Sam was still in the back seat, I gave him an antidote to the sleeping pills so he would regain consciousness in about 2 or 3 minutes, and left a note under his keys in the front seat. The note said, "Sam, if you even talk to Abigail Grimes again, let alone sleep with her, you will end up as you look now. But in reality, that is, if you survive after they'll beat you up, from a friend." Copies of photos of Sam looking like he was on the verge of death were delivered to Abigail at work during her shift on Saturday morning, with another note: "This is what will happen to any guy you sleep with that isn't your husband." This apparently ended Sam and Abigail's relationship and frightened Abigail so much that she became temporarily more cautious, so that although I kept a close eye on the situation for the next 18 months, I had no further reports of suspected infidelity. Also, Abigail's display of behavior seemed to change for the better when I saw her. Maybe she suspected that I was behind the photos so she could behave as best she could in my presence. I wasn't sure. A little over 18 months after the incident with Sam, I received a message about Abigail and another man. Although she probably slept with Sam about half a dozen times before I intervened, this time I think the notification came around the time the first incident occurred, mainly because I was periodically illegally monitoring Abigail's phone calls. Although I was unable to prevent it, I saw her leaving Jason McMurray's garden apartment about 90 minutes after finishing her Saturday shift at the beauty salon. McMurray was a very attractive but frail guy. Perhaps it was Abigail's great dignity that attracted him to her, but it certainly wasn't her muscles. I was afraid that if I handled him too roughly, he might get seriously hurt or die. Becky had a cunning plan. One of our good clients was Doc on Call, a medical clinic about 2 miles from Jimmy and Abigail's home. The business manager there was a friend of ours in addition to being a client, and we got her out of half a dozen sticky situations with bad employees, rowdy patients, embezzlement, etc., charging very reasonable fees. A few days after Abigail's affair with Jason, when I knew Jimmy worked until 10 at night, Becca, disguised as a health inspector, paid Abigail a visit. "Are you Mistress Abigail Grimes?" "Yes, how can I help you?" "I'm Ruth Bader with the Department of Health. Let's get straight to the point. There is an outbreak of gonorrhea, and we are notifying people who may have had sexual contact with an infected person and asking them to get tested. Do you know Jason McMurray?" According to Becca, Abigail's face paled. Well, yeah. "He's one of the suspected hosts," Becca said with real concern in her voice. "I don't want to intrude on your privacy. I just want to encourage you to get tested if you have had sexual contact of any kind with Mr. McMurray. Here's a coupon that entitles you to free, confidential testing at your local health clinic, Doc Call, on Pine Grove Avenue. I encourage you to use it. If you have any questions, you can call me at the number on my card and leave a message." When Becca handed Abigail a coupon and a card with a secondary cell phone number, Abigail almost fell over. The coupon specifically stated to ask our friend, the business manager, and to tell the receptionist that it was for a free test. The next day, a worried Abigail appeared on Doc on Call. Our friend put on a lab coat and led her into the exam room, pretending to be a medical technician. She drew some blood, took a swab from her private area, looked through a microscope, and seemed worried. "You appear to have contracted gonorrhea, Ms. Grimes, but fortunately it was at a very early stage. I need to confirm this with a blood test, but in the meantime, here are the pills for you and your husband. You should each take 2 pills a day with meals for 10 days. I will call you when the test results come back, and if the preliminary test was false positive, I will advise you to stop taking them." "But my husband can't find out about this," Abigail pleaded, starting to cry. "Just add the pills to his food. They break up and dissolve easily. He'll never know." "Okay," Abigail replied, seeming a little relieved. "Can I give you my cell phone number so you can call me? Please don't call home." "Everything will be confidential, don't worry," our friend replied. The pills were a placebo. 2 days later, our friend called Abigail and told her that she did indeed have gonorrhea, and asked her to return to the clinic for a follow-up examination the next day after she took her last 2 pills. When she returned, our friend declared her completely free of the disease. At my request, Our friend did run a blood and smear test on Abigail to make sure, and luckily, she was STD-free. The same night Becca visited Abigail, I visited Jason under the guise. When he opened the door, I rushed in, chloroformed him without hurting him, taped his mouth shut, and handcuffed him to a chair. When he came to, I was wearing a mask and with a message. "Jason, why did you sleep with Abigail Grimes?" After asking, I pulled the tape off his mouth. "Oh, to answer your question, I like her," he answered hesitantly, obviously scared. "Did you know she was married?" Well, not really. She told me they were divorced and she was getting a divorce." He stuttered, clearly scared. "Did you know she has gonorrhea?" "What?" "No, of course not. I would never have slept with her if I had known that." "Let's make it easy for you, Jason. She's married. Her husband thinks he's happy. He's not divorced or getting a divorce. And she does have gonorrhea. You need to go get tested tomorrow. Regardless of the test results, there's no way you can do anything else. Contact her. No calls, no meetings, no emails, no text messages, absolutely nothing. If you contact her again, gonorrhea will be the least of your problems. Understand?" "Yes, of course, absolutely," he muttered, so scared that he wet his pants. "I'm glad you understand. I'll leave the handcuff key on your patio. Wait 60 seconds after I leave, then drag your chair over there and get it. I don't want to have to go back to you again," I said menacingly. "You won't have to. Trust me," he squealed. This solved the problem with Jason and Abigail, and hopefully a lot of other potential connections in light of the gonorrhea threat. But there was still a serious problem on the horizon. Her name was Jersey, who tried to set Abigail up with several guys. I felt like we really needed to get rid of Jersey's bad influence in Abigail's life. Luckily, she made it easy. Jersey had no marketable skills. Although she engaged in sexual services, it was not enough to make ends meet. Local police believed that she was involved in the trafficking of illegal drugs, mainly oxycodone and other prescription drugs. But since she was a fairly small player, they could not afford to devote the resources necessary to catch her in the act. My team could. After just 2 nights of physical observation and a bug in Jersey's trailer, we learned when her next delivery was due to arrive. Beyond our wildest hopes, she was actually going to participate in a pharmacy robbery with her boyfriend and a local gangster. I alerted the cops to the planned robbery, gave them the name and address of the pharmacy, the date and expected time, and the likely participants. Luckily, the pharmacy was one of the ones that had been broken into a few months ago, and it was already on the watch list. So the cops had a legitimate reason to plant there without using the tip I provided. The robbery attempt and arrest went off without a hitch. Jersey skipped bail, had a prior criminal record, and stole thousands of dollars worth of illicit substances during a robbery. She faced at least 5 years of hard work and was no longer a threat to Abigail. The gonorrhea incident probably scared Abigail for a while. A year after the incident, she and Jimmy gave birth to a girl, Bethany. They also got lucky. With the lottery ticket Abigail bought, they won about $400,000 after taxes. Being the kind soul that Jimmy is, he insisted that the money be put into an account just for Abigail in case anything happened to me. Of course, she agreed, although I suggested that they split them up. I quickly became attached to Bethany. Having never had a girl in our family, I spoiled her at every opportunity. By the time she was 3 years old, she tied Jimmy as my favorite person in the world. This made me even more worried when I received another report, a few days before Bethany's 3rd birthday, that Abigail had probably returned to her old habits. This time, the guy was a low-life guy named Joe Marley. While I could at least understand her attraction to the first two, this guy was a thug with a criminal record and was on parole. I decided it was time for a serious conversation with Abigail, without baby gloves for her lovers. As soon as Marley and Abigail walked into the cheap motel, which she paid for, Brett and I sprang into action. We literally knocked down the door. I hit Marley in the jaw as hard as I could, knocking him down, then Brett pulled him out. Abigail was buttoning her blouse, looking at me with frightened eyes. "Abigail, this ends now," I shouted. "I won't let you humiliate Jimmy and Bethany again. This is the only time I've cheated, Will. You have to believe me," she moaned. "Don't tell me that crap. What about Jason McMurray and Sam Hastings, and who knows how many others there were?" I shouted. "What are you going to do?" She trembled, looking at me with scared eyes, like a deer in headlights. "Please don't tell Jimmy. It will really hurt him." "What if you care about not hurting him?" I laughed. "I'm letting you know, bitch. I'm going to make you do something to make sure this doesn't happen again, because I know how hard it is for you to keep your knees together." Looking at her with fury, I deliberately showed off my Beretta and stated my terms. "You will enter into a contract with me. If you cheat on Jimmy again, you will waive all claims to your lottery winnings, and it will automatically go into trust in Bethany's name, where I will be the sole trustee. You will never allow the account to drop below $350,000 without my permission. You will agree to mental health counseling. If you do not agree to my terms or change again, you will promise not to try to get custody of Bethany or any other children you have, and I will tell Jimmy about all your affairs, and I'll find him the best divorce lawyer in the state." Abigail went from looking scared to looking resigned, her eyes downcast. "If Jimmy decides with my support to divorce you, I will do everything possible to ensure that he gets sole custody of Bethany, even if it means perjuring himself. Understood?" Abigail began to cry. "I don't know if I can cope," she sobbed. "I need more sex than Jimmy can give. I hate it, but I can't handle it." "You better figure out how," I said with steely determination. "I ordered a contract to be drawn up, and you will come to my house to sign it next week. Otherwise, trouble will begin." As I turned to leave, I said, "By the way, in case you were wondering, your lover Marley got what he deserved and he won't be here anymore. In fact, I knew that by then Brett had beaten him to a pulp and left him a bus ticket to Las Vegas with the message to leave town, or he would be killed. An empty threat, but one Marley would probably take seriously. For 3 days, rumors circulated on the streets that Marley had gone to Nevada and sold almost everything he owned. When I brought Abigail to my home the following week after the lawyer had prepared the first draft of the contract between Abigail and me, I realized for the first time in my life that I had underestimated her intelligence and determination. When Abigail arrived, she was dressed tastefully, and her hair and makeup were perfect. There was no doubt that her figure was still a $9.99 even after having a baby. And now that her appearance was no longer like trailer trash, I believe that 99% of straight men would find her very attractive. I bought us both soft drinks, then sat across from Abigail at my kitchen table. "Here is the first draft of the contract from my lawyer that I told you about," I said kindly, handing it to Abigail. "Thank you, Will," she said, smiling, touching my hand as she took it from me. "It looks like you put a lot of effort and expense into putting it together," she said with a smile as she read it. "The lawyer owes me a favor," I smiled back. "So it only costs me tickets to the baseball game. You know, this is a stupid question, but you really love Jimmy, don't you?" she remarked as she neared the end, this time with an even bigger smile. "He and Bethany are my 2 favorite people in the world," I replied with determination in my voice. "I know you never really liked me, Will. Why is that?" she continued with a smile full of realization. "Do you really want to know, and do we really need to talk about this?" I asked. "I think this will be very helpful, Will," she said, moving the contract towards me and touching my hand again. "Be completely honest, because I will be honest with you." "Okay," I said after a deep breath. "Actually, at school I didn't like you because I thought you were vulgar, rude, and frivolous. Trailer trash, good only for sex and nothing else. I tried to convince Jimmy not to marry you, but he was in love with you. Since he loved you, I decided that you must have some good qualities, so I reconsidered my opinion." Abigail almost blushed. Almost. "I think, Abigail, that you are much better now than you were at school. You are no longer cheap. You are gentle with Jimmy. You don't boss him around like a bitch. And as far as I can see, you are a good mother. I can honestly say that I almost love you now. In fact, I would love you if it weren't for you cheating on Jimmy behind his back, including giving him gonorrhea." "How did you know about this?" she asked, completely surprised. I have connections everywhere. Back to the question, this contract is designed to change what I don't like about you, Jimmy's infidelity. You know, you're a really good person, Will, Abigail said with a different smile from the previous ones, one that I couldn't quite place. Jimmy has always been happy to have you as his champion because, as we both know well, there are battles he cannot win, and you are the perfect fighter. I get as much from Jimmy as I give, I countered, maybe even more. He makes me believe in people. Yes, it is, Abigail laughed. There's no doubt about it. That's why I love him. I leaned across the table, took Abigail's hands in mine and said, if you love him, why can't you stop cheating? Before we continue this discussion, I need to tell you something else, Will. You're the main reason I got out of the trailer trash life in the first place, enough to attract a man as wonderful as Jimmy, Abigail said, very seriously. What? Was my brilliant answer. When you rejected me in school, even though we had the best sex imaginable, I realized that I needed to change. Otherwise, any guy worth dating wouldn't be interested in me, even with fantastic sex. This started my metamorphosis, she replied with complete sincerity. Wow, was my next brilliant remark. Will, we need to have further discussions before I fully reveal myself to you so that we can reach an agreement. Just so you know that I am not stalling and I have no ulterior motives, I want you to know that I will sign the version of the contract you showed me, although we'll probably need to make a few changes, she said, squeezing my hands. Meanwhile, I swear that I won't even flirt with other guys. That's a good start, I smiled. You know what, Will? Tomorrow Jimmy is doing one of his usual charity events from 6 to 10. Why don't you take Bethany and me to dinner? I was surprised by the offer, but any opportunity to spend time with Bethany was precious to me. Great, I replied. What time should I pick up and where do you want to go? Pick us up at 6:15 p.m. and we'll go to Bethany's favorite restaurant. Sounds like a plan, I replied, standing up. Abigail stood up too, and we chatted as I walked her to the front door. When we got there, she turned to face me, looked me in the eyes without blinking, and then said in a seductive voice, before we finish negotiating the contract, you will have to tell me if you are sexually attractive to me. So, think about this. She stood on her tiptoes, kissed my chin, then turned and hurried to the door, her perfect ass jiggling back and forth as she walked to her car. What was it? I asked myself. Then I felt aroused. The fact that my body betrayed me did not make me happy. I invited Abigail and Bethany to dinner as planned. Bethany had a great time, exhausted beyond belief, and I ended up carrying her to the car and from the car to her bed. Abigail was cheerful and joyful throughout the evening and confirmed my opinion that she is a very good mother, judging by the way she and Bethany interacted. Abigail thanked me very much as I left and gave me another kiss on the chin. And damn it, I stuck my pants out again, although I'm sure she didn't notice. A week later, Jimmy called me. Hey, Will, I need to ask you a big favor. I can't think of one that I wouldn't do, I laughed. I hope so, brother. Look, Gail and I were planning on taking Bethany to Storyland Baby Amusement Park this Saturday, but we just lost a technician at the hospital, and until she's replaced, I have extra shifts, including Saturday. Could you take Bethany and Gail there? I thought for a second. It was a little confusing, but I saw no reason to refuse. I didn't have a steady girlfriend, no Saturday plans that couldn't be canceled, and I loved being with Bethany, so I said, Sure, Jimmy. It's hardly a big favor. You know how much I love your baby. When I told her I couldn't go, she asked if Uncle Will could. She'll be delighted, Jimmy laughed. This is the beginning of a series of occasions where I went out with Abigail and Bethany. I slowly started to like Abigail more as she no longer exhibited the personality traits that made me dislike her. Apparently, a leopard can change its spots. The only problem left was trusting her to keep her thighs together. Although I was sure that Abigail had not been unfaithful to anyone except Jimmy, since I first showed her the draft contract, she had not returned to me with changes to it. Finally, about 4 months after she first saw the contract and after we had gone out together more than a dozen times, I decided to give her a push. I called her on her mobile, Hey, Gail, it's Will. I know who you are, she laughed. Bethany's boyfriend. My relationship with her is the longest I've ever had with a woman, I laughed in response. Listen, Gail, I know you haven't cheated on Jimmy since I showed you the draft contract, but we need to finish it. It's hanging over my head. I don't like unfinished business. After a pause, she said, Okay, Will. I'll tell Jimmy that he'll have to babysit Bethany one evening this week because I need to discuss something with you about her future. What evening would be right for you? How about Thursday? I asked, looking at my calendar. I'll be at your place after dinner. How about 8? Abigail replied. I'll see you then, but be prepared to finish this, I countered. I will, Abigail replied. The tone in her voice when she said this surprised me a little. When she arrived promptly at 8 on Thursday, she was dressed casually but neatly, and as always, her hair and makeup were impeccable. We exchanged hugs as we had done for the last couple of months when we greeted each other. She was carrying an envelope. After some chatting, where I was drinking a beer and she was drinking a vodka tonic, I asked, So, what's in the envelope? Her answer stunned me. Did you know that you and Jimmy are only half-brothers? She asked, very matter-of-factly. What made you ask this question? I asked, my face obviously turning pale. The DNA profiles I did for both of you, she replied after taking a sip of her drink. How did you get my DNA? I asked before realizing how stupid the question was. She had hundreds of opportunities to take the cup I drank from, the hair from my comb or samples of dozens of other parts of me over the past few months. She just smiled, and before she said anything else, I said, Actually, forget about it. Why did you do DNA tests on Jimmy and me? Because of the change I want to make to the contract you showed me. She laughed. Seeing my puzzled look, she continued, I'll explain later. Well, did you know? Yes, I knew, but I hope you didn't tell Jimmy, I replied. I didn't tell him. I don't think he'll like to know that the person who raised him isn't his biological father, and that his mother was unfaithful. How did you find out, and when? It doesn't matter. I've known this since middle school. What matters is, why did you get this information? The last time we talked about the contract, I told you that I would be honest with you, and I will be honest with you. She said, her face contorting. I have 2 problems. First of all, I'm not getting enough sex with Jimmy to satisfy me, and I haven't been able to solve this problem no matter how hard I've tried since he and I got married, and I've tried hard, including visiting a psychiatrist. This was news to me, the psychiatric part. Did you really seek professional help? I asked, with newfound respect for her. 3, actually, at one time or another. This brings me to the second problem. Although I truly love Jimmy and would do anything for him, except hold my thighs. Together, I think, I crave you. I've always wanted you ever since you got me in high school. This was news to me, too. Except for the wedding reception, she hasn't come to see me since my sophomore year of college. That brings me to the contract change, she said, standing up from her chair and slowly removing her blouse, then her bra, then her skirt, then her panties, as she spoke. The only change I want to make to the contract is who I can have sex will be determined by specific DNA alleles, namely those that you and Jimmy have in common. By then, she had removed all her clothes and came to me and sat on my lap, which was not easy as I was horny. When she gave me a wicked French kiss, I started to lose my composure. In my defense, I haven't had good sex in 6 months. No sex at all for 6 weeks. Her body was the best I've ever seen in person. I have vivid memories of her, and I, having sex in high school before, were still mine. It was the most physical satisfaction I had felt in months. Over the past few months, I had really started to like her, and I liked having her around, and she seemed genuinely interested in solving her problem with extramarital affairs, albeit in an unusual way. After a few minutes of exchanging drools and me massaging her almost perfectly big breasts, she got down on her knees and made me feel good. Afterwards, we had wild sex for 2 hours. After showering and dressing, she took out the draft contract. The only change she made was replacing Jimmy's name with a scientific description of the DNA alleles that Jimmy and I shared. She initiated and dated the change and signed the contract. I did the same. She kissed me passionately and then, with a devilish smile on her face, said, "Call me this weekend, and we can set up a sex schedule." I simply nodded in agreement. "And put this contract in your safe and tell your lawyer it's there," she said as she walked out the door. I was useless at work on Friday. I had a strange mixture of euphoria, guilt, self-hatred, and excitement. After a sleepless Friday night, when I called Gail on Saturday morning, I realized my situation. Sex with her was the best it could be. I was too weak to stay away from her, and I knew that if she didn't sleep with me, she would find someone else, which would ultimately lead to the destruction of Jimmy's marriage. After we made passionate love again that Saturday, we showered together and then had a business meeting. We discussed how we could have sex twice a week, spend 1 or 2 nights together every 3 or 4 months, and be sure Jimmy would never find out about it. Given the knowledge I had gained from my business, her wily mind, my financial resources, and the fact that my home was isolated and only 3 miles from Jimmy's, we came up with a foolproof plan that included no public displays of affection, inside 2 hours. Gail joined the health club I was a member of, and once a week we work out at the same time for about 45 minutes and then have sex in a soundproof massage room for another 30 minutes. One afternoon a week, when Jimmy is working a long shift at the hospital, she brings Bethany to my parents' house, her parents' house, or the nanny's. And Gail comes to my house for 2 hours. My sexual relationship with Gail has been going on for 7 years. The only time we had sex with a condom was when he and Jimmy were trying to have another baby. I needed to be sure he was the father. After she got pregnant, unlike her first pregnancy, her libido skyrocketed and I had to own her 4 times a week, on top of the fact that she was wearing Jimmy out. The only time in those 7 years we didn't have regular sex was the month after Alicia, my second niece, was born, and Jimmy's family went on vacation. In these 7 years, I know for sure that Abigail has not only never been with another man, but also has no desire to be with him. Cynic that I am, I even gave her a few tests on her loyalty, tests that she definitely would have failed before we signed our contract, but now passed with flying colors. Abigail and I never said "I love you" to each other. I'm not sure I know what romantic love is. I love Jimmy, Bethany, and Alicia, and I almost love my parents, but it's family love. I love my coworkers and a few other people as friends, but without any romantic involvement. I do know that I value my time with Abigail, even if we don't have sex, and she fully satisfies any possible sexual desires I might have. Abigail has completely overcome her trailer trash roots. She contributes to the community, is a wonderful wife to Jimmy, and a wonderful mother to her girls. I also think that Abigail is still as horny towards me as she was during her school days. She really seems content and enjoying life. I truly believe what she said to me in the midst of our meeting last week's meeting in the massage room. "Will, I'm so happy. I never thought life could be so good and full." Subscribe to our channel so that your second chaff doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.